I've spoken in other episodes about particular projects, and those are just some of them. In this overview, I want to go through much more quickly a number of related projects which may be expanded later, but at the moment it's fine to just give a short overview. The first is a theme in the preservation of oral cultures, which came up with the Nepal project and also the Nagas to a certain extent. From very early on, I've been interested in trying to see what could be preserved from the great period of anthropological fieldwork from the 19th century and from contemporary field analysis. So much of the culture, language, traditions, customs of small groups of people on the edge of capitalist civilization is being lost every day. And it seemed to me that it would be too late to do this soon, so I should try as much as I could with colleagues and friends to preserve something from the wreckage, a kind of Noah's Ark of cultures. So it was probably influenced by my own experience in Nepal and also my encounter with Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf, who was a great rescue anthropologist. And it is a tradition in anthropology, the idea of disappearing worlds which should be documented before they go. So I started to work on Heimendorf's own collections, the films, the diaries, the field notes in relation to the Nagas, and more generally his wonderful film collection which he left with me and which with Mark Turing we had digitized and is increasingly available on the web. That was one set of an anthropologist's field materials. I also, through my wife, who was a bookseller, was made aware of other sets of field materials and life materials of a number of distinguished older colleagues of mine, like John Barnes, Gwilym Jones, G.I. Jones, and others. And so, rather than watching these things thrown onto a skip, I, over the years, managed to save hundreds of boxes of fieldwork materials, particularly in relation to Africa, and particularly a wonderful set of materials in relation to the Rose Livingston Institute, to which John Barnes was the secretary. And these were put in a room in our department and moved back and forth and up and down for a number of years, and were finally taken off at my expense to the Museum of Empire and Commonwealth in Bristol, which has been closed, but I gather the Bristol Record Office is taking over this material, so that's been saved for posterity. So those were digital recovery and preservation projects, which expanded in 2002, around 2002, with Mark Turing, who set up the digital Himalaya project. This was the idea of experimenting with the web to see what could be put on it: photographs, films, field notes, journals, out of print and difficult to obtain journals about the Himalayan region, that is northern India, Nepal, Ladakh, Bhutan, across that whole region. So since then this project has grown and been very successful, and Mark Turing has pioneered this work. We then decided, or I decided it would be interesting to try and do the same thing for the Far East. So with Xiaoshan Yan, we set up the Digital Orient project, much smaller in scale, but that is up and off my website, and you can see films of craftsmen and interviews and so on. It was really just alive for a couple of years, but it might be revived. So that was that. The these projects then expanded out into a project which has lasted for 3 or 4 years now, of which Mark Turin is the executive director and I'm a trustee, called the World Oral Literature Project, supported by the Firebird Foundation at the beginning and by Charles Chadwick Healy, the chairman of the foundation. And this, located in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge and later co-located in Yale University in America, this is a very ambitious project to fund fieldwork, to collect together fieldwork materials that have already been accumulated and to make them available to people on the web. And later this was put under the umbrella of the Vanishing Worlds Foundation, which we set up. And this is an ongoing project to expand, continue the kind of work I'd been doing earlier on. And I hope that one day Mark will give more information about that project. Another theme is work in relation to television. Television companies have always been interested in working with academics, and I had that experience of working with groups of television producers several times, and almost always found it very stimulating and interesting, and giving you access to places and materials which are very expensive to locate and difficult for an academic on his or her own to use. So I've been charting some of these because something about me makes it the case that when I'm involved in a project with anyone, including my own life and university career, I like to document it alongside actually doing it. So the first of these was very early in 1984, 5, 6, the BBC Doomsday Project. This wasn't a film project, it was to make a video disc or 2 video discs about the state of Britain in the mid-1980s to celebrate the Doomsday disc. I've talked about it elsewhere. But as well as being on the board making the disc, I decided to keep an account. So I kept the minutes of the meetings and jotted down things. So I have a small archive of the making of this disc, and this was fortunate because some of the bits and pieces I kept were then available when the disc had to be remade. It was almost lost, all this work, and I had a few bits that were helpful there. And I wrote an article explaining a little bit of the anthropology of the making of the disc, how we selected this and that and excluded this and that. So there is an account there. Then through the late 80s, or through the 80s and 90s, I was involved in several other television projects. One was to make a film with Sarah Harrison about a book we'd written on some robbers, burglars, coin clippers in 17th century Cumbria, the Justice and the Mayor's Ale. So there was a Time Watch film on that, and I put that film up on my website. There was a film which was partly about Earl's Cone, about English documents, and they came and interviewed us, and that's up. There was a film about legal records and history, and I was interviewed for that, and a set of parts of that interview are also up on my website. So these were various television projects, and I'll talk about others in relation to China in a minute. The main one, however, was when in 1997, I suppose, or perhaps 8, the head of one of the chairmen of Windfall Films, David Dugan, came to visit me in Cambridge and said that Channel 4 were planning to make a 6-part series to celebrate the millennium in 2000, and he would like to make a historical film, and he'd been referred to me and Simon Schaffer as people who might have some ideas for what could be done. So together we devised a 6-part series, starting with one day, the day of the rocket train went from Liverpool to Manchester, and then back 100 years, 250 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, studying the developments which had led up to that momentous day of the launch of steam railways. And with David, I filmed this over a couple of years, and while I was doing it, again I thought this is really a unique opportunity to record how a television series is made. And I asked David, and he kindly supplied me with copies, VHS copies of all the filming, and I and Sarah did some filming while the films were being made. It was enormously exciting. It was structured around a set of seminars held in Cambridge, 5 people talking about the history of the world from their different perspectives over the last 10,000 years, which I chaired. And that was filmed extensively. And we also filmed on location all over England, well, in bits of England and Scotland. We went to a Benedictine abbey in the north of Scotland, a print works in the south, to glass-making works, and all sorts of places, and filmed there. We've filmed together in Venice, in Istanbul, in Nepal, in Japan, and I filmed in Australia and others filmed in China. So there was something like 400 hours of film made, but as is usual with television films, almost all of it is discarded, put away, finally perhaps thrown away. But I decided to try and use that film and other films we had taken to chronicle the making of a television series. So on my website there is a world history. It's on the front page, which takes you to the stages of the making of the film. The films we made as we were discussing what could be done, the preparation as it were, the conversations, that is the actual films of the seminar, the complete films of academic seminars of that time, the explorations I extracted, and it wasn't easy in that technology of about 2000, I extracted the film of our travels and explorations, the fuller film, about 50 hours out of the 400 hours of the best film, which otherwise would have been lost. The final stories, in other words, the 6 films that were made are up, and then finally something about the making, something about the editing, the decisions of editing, and a post-mortem on the whole thing and a party after it was launched. So there is a big archive, as far as I know, the only one on the web, of how a television series is actually made. So those were my encounters with television. Another thread is the study of universities. From the age of 18, when I went to Oxford, until 1967, some 50 years later, when I retired from my university professorship at Cambridge, I have been a university academic or student, travelling from university to university, holding posts in history and anthropology. And I realise now that this was my longest participant observer fieldwork, that's anthropology, an anthropology of my life. And while most academics write about other things, I realised that it would be interesting to reflect on different aspects of this experience through the ages. I'd obviously kept personal diaries. I kept almost all my papers of my teaching and my research projects, diaries and travels around the place. So I had a huge set of materials about being an academic. And the interest became focused in various ways a few years ago. Partly by accidents. For instance, I was asked to write the preface to a book on Oxford anthropology, and I thought I should write a slightly facetious, short analysis of Oxford anthropologists and anthropology from an anthropological point of view. So why was Oxford anthropology so good, and how had the culture of Oxford contributed to this? And I was asked later to do a piece for a book on King's College, Cambridge, which was in the same vein, and a piece on the history of my department, social anthropology in Cambridge, which analysed it from a partly anthropological point of view. These stimuli were added to considerably by beginning to teach in my last 5 or 10 years, particularly students from the Far East, a number of Japanese students and students working on Japan, and a number of Chinese students and students working on China. And I realised increasingly through their bewilderment about British culture, about British history, about British academic life, and in particular about Cambridge and how it worked, that it might be useful to reflect for visitors to Cambridge, for students at Cambridge, and even for my younger colleagues, how Cambridge and academic work in life in England worked. So this took two main forms. One was a book, Reflections on Cambridge, which was published in 2009, which looked at the culture, the politics, the history, the way colleges and departments worked, the way teaching works, research, the creativity of a great university, and so on. So this was in written form with a few photographs. But I was also encouraged to make some films. My translator, Xiaolong, visited England, and she said it would be nice to make some films for a Chinese audience about how Cambridge and its history worked. And so we went round on a summer's day, and she asked me 20 or so questions, and I tried to answer them to camera about my experience of Cambridge. Later, a couple of years later, with another of my friends from China, a former student, Xu Bei, who was a television producer, she went round with me and did a similar sort of set of films with a possibility of using this material in a Chinese context, which hasn't happened. So we made these films. So there are 30 or 40 films from the inside point of view, filmed within the institution by someone who has been a member of it, not by journalists or outsiders. So I think this is unusual, and as an anthropologist and someone who'd written a book on Cambridge, there are certain ways of looking at it which would make it unusual. So there are these films and writings about Cambridge and how it works, which a lot of them are up on my website and a number on YouTube and so on. Another filming project which is worth mentioning is not related to Cambridge, but also involved Xiaolong and my Chinese film friends, which was that, and David Dugan, was that I was very struck by the book of the great Victorian lady traveller Isabella Bird, Up the Yangtze Gorge and Beyond. So with David and with Zhao Bing, a well-known Chinese documentary filmmaker, we spent a couple of weeks going up the Yangtze to the top of the Yangtze in Sichuan, filming about how the villages, many of them flooded of course in the Yangtze Gorge, how they looked now, and trying to relate this back to Isabella's earlier journey. This was planned for Chinese television, and again it didn't come off, but all the 30 hours or so of film is available, and we hope to use that and put it on the web shortly. It was based around my wife Sarah's experiences and her to-camera observations as someone exactly the age of Isabella when she went up in the 1890s up the gorge. Another entirely different set of materials, or at least it overlaps of course, are materials about my family and my own personal life. Because I haven't thrown away anything much since I was about 18, and because Sarah and I have kept diaries, account books and other materials since we've been together, I have a huge set of materials about my own life and life with Sarah, but also of earlier generations. My grandmother was a great hoarder of family archives, and my family goes back through various branches through India, Jamaica, Burma, China, and so we have boxes and boxes of material, letters, diaries from the 20th century, many photographs of a set of imperial families and their experiences, ending up with wonderful letters and materials of my mother over her life, and then my own materials. And so one of my plans for retirement has been to, with Sarah, to sort all this out, to put it into a database, to deposit the original archives in various locations, particularly the Cambridge University Library, and to scan the documents, to make a database, and to use the films. Just the family films themselves, because I started making a very detailed film study, as I had in Nepal, of my adopted niece Prem Kumari. I made a film study of my granddaughters Lily and Rosa, and of my own family from the 1970s onwards. So there are several hundred hours of family film and all the contextual material of letters and diaries and so on. A lot of it is very private, and one has ethical and other problems about using it, but gradually it will be put into a time capsule and available in the future. Finally, returning to methodology, a lot of this digital work comes out of an interest which I've had since I started as an undergraduate, and perhaps before, in seeing how you can link material. I learnt early on that the secret of academic work and discovery is the famous phrase, only connect, made by, of course, Ian Forster, Rosa Luxemburg and many others. Connecting hitherto unconnected pieces of information is what discovery is about. And so as an undergraduate, I began to work out the best way of storing, preserving and connecting material. And my interest was hugely increased by encountering a PhD student at Nuffield College called Brian Harrison, now Sir Brian Harrison, a distinguished historian, and he had devised a method. Beatrice Webb had devised a method in her autobiography called One Fact, One Card, with her husband, where you wrote down on a piece of paper small bits of information, then shuffled them around and wrote from that. And Brian had expanded this and refined it and showed me his card indexing system, and from then on I devised a number of different card indexes for my research and accumulated cross-references to my library and my original manuscript collections. This grew from a few from one tomato box, as it were, up to something like 15 or 20,000 cards by the early 1980s. But then I ran into all sorts of problems which I hadn't been warned about, the difficulty of keeping it up to date, of filing away, of finding things, of changing one's classifications. And so for a while it gathered dust. And then with the advent of computers, and particularly my work with Martin Porter on information retrieval and probabilistic retrieval systems, I realized that I could put this material into a computer, and with the help of Penny Lang and money from Jerry Martin, we put in materials into what I later called the topics database. And this is accessible off my website, though at the moment it needs to be redone and is not quite available, but will be again soon. And here we expanded this so that there are over 60,000 different quotations. It's in many ways a period piece. Research has moved on, but it gives a glimpse of the reading and ideas of a historian and anthropologist in the second half of the 20th century, and there may be serendipitous pieces of information useful for people who are doing research in various fields. This was linked to a wider interest in how one does research. I worked with computer scientists, the audiovisual aids unit, and all sorts of people, as we've seen, to try out techniques of research. And I've always been particularly interested in what makes us creative. What are the contexts? Creativity is much more than hard work or methodologically rigorous analysis. It's a whole style of life. The way we organize our lives, even down to things like music, walking, friendships, travels, all these things, and the way we arrange our desks, our libraries, all this feeds into our creative output. And so I've always been interested in that and written something about it, and I made a film called Paths of Creativity, which is up on my website, explaining and exploring a bit of this within my own home and garden. I've also been interested in how best to write. I've written a lot of books and articles and gradually devised techniques of writing, whether it's best to use computers in the first stage, later stages, and there are bits and pieces of my reflections on this on my website, and also in a film called How to Write a Dissertation, which is up on my website on YouTube. So we come full circle. My life has been a set of explorations through different media, through friendships, through working with people, through exploring the boundaries of the use of digital technology from the very earliest days of a computer as I encountered it in 1973 up to my present reflections in 2012.